Greetings, Training for Translators listeners. This is Corinne McKay with episode 23 of the Training for Translators podcast. What now? 6 options if your freelance business is struggling. But before we dive into this episode, I wanted to encourage you to check out my upcoming challenge group, March Marketing Madness. You can find more information on that in the classes tab of trainingfortranslators.com. And also, if you look at my recent blog posts, the blog tab of trainingfortranslators.com, you'll see a link to a free preview of the class if you want to try before you buy. So, March Marketing Madness starts on March 2nd. This is the 8th year that I run it. Last year we had 125 people, and this year is looking just as good, if not better. And for $95 through February 15th, or $99 thereafter, you get a month of daily motivational videos, at least 3 options for a marketing challenge that will take you 15 to 30 minutes, an optional but very fun Slack group, and new this year, 3 live sessions. So if you think that might be helpful to you to do some more marketing in a supportive environment, head on over to trainingfortranslators.com, click classes if you'd like to go ahead and just sign up, or click the blog tab and you'll find the blog post that has the link to the free preview. Now, moving on to our topic for today. Atypically, this is not based on a blog post. It's based on a free webinar that I taught today called What Now? I aimed this specifically at mid-career freelance translators who are, in my opinion, the group of people who are struggling the most with what you might call the new world order, right? Where you can't really have 3 agencies and a Gmail address anymore if you want to have a thriving freelance business. So we talked for a whole hour about that topic. But what I wanted to focus on in this podcast episode is that I came up with 6 options. If your freelance business is struggling, 6 things you might want to think about doing. And with any major decision in life, I am a big fan of putting all the options on the table. Even if you think it's something that would not work out for you or that you might not want to do, just consider the option so that you are making an informed decision. Because I think that if your freelance business is struggling, you know, because you're a smart person, that I can't tell you what to do, right? Because I'm not you. I can tell you what I would do. And of course, I approach this from the perspective that 2025 was, as I talked about in the past episode of the Training for Translators podcast, 2025 was my most successful year financially in 23 years of freelancing. I worked too much, but I'm working on remedying that for this year, setting a goal of earning the same amount, if not more, while working a little bit less. And I also come from the context that marketing really does not bother me. I don't love it. Like I tell people all the time, what do you call people who work in who love marketing? Salespeople, right? If marketing were really your calling, you'd work in sales. But marketing really doesn't bother me. I just see it as like something that I have to do to have a thriving freelance business. But the sort of core of the session that I taught today was 6 options you may want to consider if your freelance business is struggling. So first, I'm just going to read you the 6 options, and then we'll talk in depth about each one. And if you hear some computer noises in the back, if you hear me clicking, it's because I'm using my notes from the webinar, my slides from the webinar as notes for this podcast episode. So here we go. Here are the 6 options. Number 1, keep doing what you're doing and hope that things improve. Number 2, offer the same services, but to better clients. Option 3, branch out into work that agencies still pay well for. Option 4, look at other freelance word services. Word is in, quotation marks. Option 5, look at salaried jobs that you could do with your current skills. And option 6, retrain and change careers completely. Now, let's talk about those in depth. Now, as I alluded to at the start, the hard part here is that I feel like a lot of struggling mid-career freelancers who have worked for well-paying agency clients for a long time and are having a really tough time making the transition to direct clients, they ask me a lot, "What would I do?" And the hard part there is not that I don't wanna tell you. I'm actually happy to tell you what I would do, but the problem is that I'm not you. And I think when we think about these huge decisions in our lives, like, for example, should I continue being a translator? Should I continue being a freelancer at all? If I look for a salary job, should I look for something I can apply to today, or should I retrain and do something entirely different? It depends on so many factors that are specific to our individual situation. And a few that I mentioned in the webinar are your location, your overall financial resources, your previous careers or other skills, your ability or desire to go back to school, your ability or desire or interest in moving to a new location, and then I think one of the biggest ones is constraints related to your family situation, your spouse, your children, your aging parents, et cetera, et cetera. So, for example, I recently talked to two translators in totally opposite situations here. One of them said, "Look, like I am the main wage earner in a family where my spouse stays home full time with our three young children. We have a fairly large mortgage and we have 2 car loans." And I talked to someone who said, like, "Look, it's just me. I'm single, I have no children, I really have no financial commitments. Maybe this is a sign from the universe that I should, like, go live on a beach in a really inexpensive country in Southeast Asia for a year and think about what I wanna do with my life." So that's why I can't tell you what to do. But let's dive in on the 6 options. Option to keep doing what you're doing. I think I see a lot of translators asking, could we see the pendulum swing back toward human translators? Or is it possible that enough translators don't want to do things like machine translation, post editing, that agencies will have trouble finding enough people, or that enough translators will leave the profession, that agencies will have trouble finding enough people, period? My answer to that is, like, stranger things have happened, but I wouldn't make that your plan A. I do think someone in the webinar mentioned that they do gaming translation and have actually seen this happening, that several companies that switched to AI have now gone back to human translators. And I will say that a couple of people I know who work for large translation companies have said, our end clients are realizing you spend the money on one thing or you spend it on another. Like if you switch over to your own trained large language model, then you have to have IT specialists and quality assurance people to maintain the large language model, or you can pay human translators to just do the translations, right? To my assessment of that strategy, like try to sort of wait the AI boom out would be like, I've been surprised before, but I would not have that be your main strategy. Next option, offer the same services but to different clients. In my opinion, this is the best option for many people because, in my case, for example, my direct clients are not any more work than my previous agency clients. I'd say the same amount of work or less work for 2 to 4 times the money. And I will tell you, because I work for a lot of clients like this, that there are a lot of direct clients out there that really don't care about technology. My translation clients never cared about technology and still don't. But this is a lot of selling, right? Finding direct clients is a lot more work than finding agency clients. And the truth is that some people just cannot make themselves do enough of it consistently enough to have those real, what I would call anchor clients as direct clients, like those clients that are sending you 10,000, 20,000, $30,000 of work a year. And I think it's a lot more typical among freelance translators that they have these small one-off direct clients, saying like they send me a, €250 job 3 times a year. Well, that it's a start. It's better than nothing, but that's not enough to live off of. Next option, do something that agencies still pay well for. Here, I would say the key is your skills. There are sort of sweet spots out there, but for very specialized work. Two examples that sprang to mind for me are conference interpreting and medical linguistic validation for people with a strong scientific background. So, for example, I work mostly for Canadian conference interpreting agencies, and they pay what I would consider quite good money to mostly interpret for business meetings that don't require a huge amount of preparation. Most of my quote unquote conference interpreting work is actually business meetings, and they're mostly for clients I work for over and over. So, whereas if you're interpreting one day conference on microfinance and you don't know anything about microfinance, you might spend 2 days preparing for that one-day conference. But a lot of my business meeting interpreting is like I read the documentation for the meeting, I look up stuff, topics that maybe I'm not familiar with, but I would consider it quite good money. And same thing I hear, I don't do scientific translation, but same thing I hear from people who do linguistic validation of medical and scientific documents. So what that is, and it's a lot more complicated than this, but the nutshell version is that you are quality assuring or reviewing or validating not just the translation, but the actual scientific content. And same thing. I know I have, I wouldn't say a number of people, but I've talked fairly regularly to people who are making what I would consider quite good money doing that for agencies, but it's because they have a strong scientific background. So, this idea of provide a service that agencies still pay well for, I would consider that, but only if you have those sorts of skills or you're interested in developing them. Next option, other types of freelance, quote unquote, word work. I think the main thing to think about here is is part of the problem that you're not cut out to be a freelancer, because there is no shame in that. We're going to get to that in a couple of minutes. If you aren't cut out to be a freelancer, I don't know that changing services is going to help that much, but let's talk about it. Again, you're going to need specialized skills and a willingness to promote your services. But two things that I would look at are fact checking and high level editing for non native speakers, particularly if you are a native English speaker. So I recently went to a presentation by a freelance writer who started a fact checking agency in 2024, and she already has 40 fact checkers who work for her. And that is, again, I won't say, it feels a little weird to say specific rates on the podcast, but that is, what I would consider quite good money. Like an hour, when I say quite good money, I mean an hourly rate that translates into a six-figure income. So when I talk about good money, I mostly mean an hourly rate that if you work, most of the time at that rate would lead you to an income of more than 100,000 US dollars a year. So I think I would look at fact checking, and I would also look at not low paid per word editing for translation agencies, but things like corporate executives who are not native English speakers who have to write and present in English. And of course, you could do that in other languages too, but I just think it's a lot more common that you have people at like the corporate C-suite level who aren't native English speakers, but who have to write presentations and reports and papers and stuff in English. Next option, you could look for a salaried job that you could do with your current skills and does not require any retraining. Three things that I would look at. Number one, being a school based language teacher, high school English teacher, French teacher, Spanish teacher, that kind of thing. And interestingly enough, I feel like over the past 20 years, one of the most common trends that I have seen is language teachers becoming translators. And I kind of wonder now if we are going to see the reverse phenomenon. For what it's worth, I have a couple of consulting clients who have done exactly that in the past like 3 to 5 years. And I think obviously being a full time classroom teacher is very demanding. It is a physically and emotionally draining job. But at least in the US, the salary is fairly decent, I would say, in Public schools, you generally get excellent benefits in terms of health insurance and retirement. And in private schools, I think that you get I used to teach in a private school. You get a lot of time off. Your summer, which at the private school I taught at was paid, like they spread your salary over 12 months, so you were paid over the summer, and it really was just 8 weeks of vacation where you could do something totally different or I guess even have another job if you wanted to. Option 2, go work in-house for a translation company or language services company, for example, as a project manager or a salesperson. I think you, as an experienced freelancer, have a lot of skills that agencies are looking for, and probably a lot more than I think it's a fairly typical job for young college university graduates with, for example, a foreign language degree that they don't really know what to do with. You have a lot more experience than that. So you could go work for an agency, but probably not as a translator, more like a project manager or in sales. Option 3 for a salary job you could do with your current skills is that I would say you could go work in-house in the localization department of a company that's not a translation company. So, for example, work in-house in the localization department of a medical device company, a software company, any type of company like that. Then our final option here is retrain and change careers completely. I think that you want to make sure that you are switching to something better. And someone in the webinar very helpfully commented in the chat, don't become an entry level coder. If what is driving you out of translation is competition from AI, don't switch to another career that is following the same trajectory. Make sure that you are switching to something that is a little bit more, I hate the term future proof, but there we go, future proof. And I think two things that I would look at there are, at least in the United States, there is a huge demand for people to do education and healthcare jobs where you cannot work remotely. Education and healthcare jobs where you are in person 5 days a week and you are interacting with humans that whole time. I will also say that if this is something that appeals to you, it is becoming increasingly common, at least in the US, for teachers to leave in the middle of the year. When I was a high school teacher in the late 90s, early 2000s, you really only quit a teaching job in the middle of the year if you had like a truly catastrophic situation in your personal life. Whereas now, for example, when I was doing the research for this webinar, I looked at the job postings just for private schools in my area in Colorado, and nearly all of them had postings to start immediately. And a couple of friends of mine who are private school and public school teachers told me exactly the same thing. Like our Spanish teacher quit the first week of October for really like no stated reason. And we've been going through a series of long-term substitutes since then and are desperately trying to hire someone. So one thing I will say is that if you are interested in an education job, look now. Like it doesn't really matter. I think everything used to go on this hiring cycle that it was sort of like March through May that schools were looking to hire people, and very occasionally they'd be looking like in August. Whereas now I think it's a lot more of a year-round process. And then, of course, going back to school for a healthcare job, if that's something that appeals to you, that nearly every country in the developed world has a shortage of like nurses, physical therapists, speech therapists, people like that. Then I think the last option, which I wondered if anyone would be interested in, but it seemed like people in the webinar kind of were, is that if you are looking at retraining, I would also look at some sort of IT job where you can study toward an actual credential on your own and then look for a salary job using that credential. So, again, just like the person on the webinar said, I would not become an entry level coder because I think AI is eating that. But just as an example, I have a friend who did not have a technical background and studied on her own to become a Salesforce platform administrator. So Salesforce's huge customer relations management software tool. She did that on her own and then found a salary job paying 88,000 US dollars a year, which I think for something that you studied for on your own is a pretty nice salary. I would go through some sort of reputable certification entity and also try to sort of do your own research on what are the employment possibilities with that credential. But I think if I were in the position of thinking about changing careers completely, that idea, studying independently for some sort of IT credential, is something I would think about because I think when all of us think about going back to school, the real issue to me is not so much the length or cost of the program, but that if it's really, really full time, you can't work for that whole time. For example, I've talked to a couple of freelance translators who are considering going to law school, and which I think is not the worst idea. And I'm kind of a law nerd myself, but I think you also have to think most law schools are still full time in person. And if you cannot work for the 3 years of law school, that honestly is kind of the biggest cost hit is your lack of income. Whereas if it were interesting to you to find some sort of IT career, looking for something that you can study for part time at your own schedule and give yourself maybe a year to do that could be appealing. So there we go. 6 options to try if you are thinking, what now? And your freelance business is struggling. I hope this has been helpful. So, this is the Training for Translators podcast. You can find out all about training for translators at trainingfortranslators.com. I'm your host, Corinne McKay, and I record this on a Shure MV7 Plus microphone in Audacity, and I host it on Libsyn. Talk to you in a future episode.